I was on a chat board recently where someone had posted a meme referencing a movie I quite like, but often think doesn't get the credit it deserves. That film was The World's End by Edgar Wright. Often maligned or misunderstood, The World's End doesn't get anyone's awards or recognition, and it doesn't even hold a memorable place for those it was intended for. So on the message board, I saw a cluster of fans that were dismissing it and lambasting it. Naturally, I felt the need to interject and debate those that I saw so profusely as wrong. But more on that in a bit. For those who do not know, The World's End is a 2013 movie and the final film in Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy, also known as the Blood and Ice Cream trilogy. The film followed 2004's Shaun of the Dead and 2007's Hot Fuzz, thus completing the trilogy. And what is unique about the Cornetto trilogy is that, unlike most trilogies, the three films making the series tell three completely separate stories with zero in common with one another in regards to their core components. Different cast of characters, different settings, different plot lines, and three films are also in completely different genres. Shaun of the Dead being a horror film about zombies, Hot Fuzz being a buddy cop action film, and The World's End being a sci-fi film about robots taking over the world. So I'm sure you're asking at this point, if you're unfamiliar with these films, if these films are indeed as different as you say, what exactly makes them a trilogy? Well, let's start with the three easy explanations. 1. All three films were directed by Edgar Wright. 2. All three films were written by the combination of Wright and Simon Pegg. And 3. All three films star Pegg and Nick Frost in the lead two roles, with various other actors portraying the supporting cast. That is what binds these films through the production teams across the years, but more than that, a more dissective look at the three films, and you will notice similarities as well. Not just similarities, but intentional parallels for that matter. All three films are incredibly violent, and all three films have a scene with a Cornetto ice cream cone, hence the nickname of the Cornetto trilogy, or the Blood and Ice Cream trilogy. These films have running jokes, have important connection to English pubs, and perhaps most importantly, have strong themes about growing up. Shaun of the Dead tells us the story of a man finally accepting responsibility and taking on a role as a leader. Hot Fuzz has a central theme of remember to always be a kid at heart. And strangely enough, The World's End tells us the cautionary tale of what happens when a man refuses to grow up and constantly lives in the past. All three films center around aging in a fundamental way. That and a bunch of zombies, gunfights, and pub brawls. But moving on. With backdrop laid, why exactly did I wish to do a video on The World's End? Well, I said it right back at the beginning of the video. I don't believe The World's End gets enough credit in the context of modern sci-fi classic, or just in the context of being the third film in a highly praised film franchise. If you look at the IMDb ratings for both Shaun and Fuzz, they both are universally praised and receive an 8 out of 10, which is no small feat for comedies, mind you. But if you take a look at The World's End on its IMDb page, The World's End gets a merely 7.2 stars out of 10. Still rather high and should be worthy of a watch, but when put right up alongside its predecessors, it seems as if The World's End failed to deliver on the high expectations set by the others. So does The World's End get overlooked merely because of high expectations? Or is there a greater reason to its downgrade? I remember the conversation that sparked my desire to do this video defending The World's End. I was debating a fellow on the popular comedy site 9gag, as all of us lonely virgins tend to do. I distinctly remembered him stating that The World's End was a massive disappointment, and that he considered the 2011 comedy film Paul as to be a more deserving addition to the Cornetto series than The World's End does. This bothered me, to say the least. Not that Paul was a terrible film or anything that drastic, but come on, Paul? You're ranking a film about a talking alien with the personality of a frat boy and the voice of Seth Rogen above a comedy that tells us deep-seated truths about ourselves and society. Well, no more build-up. Let's get into it. Gary King, played by Simon Pegg, is the epitome of has-been. He's Don Quixote chasing windmills, still convinced the goal of life is stick it to the establishment that wants to turn him into some sort of corporate drone and rob him of his freedom. And what does Gary want with his freedom? To have a good time. And that's exactly what Gary intends to do. He's going to have a good time. He's going to have a party. Sparked by a revelation in his group therapy, Gary gathers up his 4 childhood friends to return to their hometown to complete the Golden Mile, essentially an epic pub crawl through several amazingly named pubs in the English village. Speaking of which, did watching this movie make anyone else want to move to England? Specifically this movie, nothing else. Downton Abbey. Throughout the first half of the movie, it's made evidently clear that Gary truly is the only member of his former squad that cares at all about completing this crawl. While his former childhood chums have all moved on in their lives, more interested and engaged in their careers or their kids or their marriages, Gary stands true as a relic of his golden youth along this golden mile. However, while Gary and his friends gladly strut along the town enjoying themselves, they start picking up on eerie sensation that everything in their town has changed, become more homogenized and gentrified. As Stephen eloquently puts near the end of the first act, Starbucking it, man. Referring to the global coffee chain Starbucks, which chooses to design their stores in more or less the same fashion all around the world, robbing neighborhoods and communities of their distinct local charm. In one word, sterile. As the night continues, the 5 friends learn that the whole corporate sterilization of their hometown doesn't just apply to their favorite pubs, but to everything and everyone. The art, the people, the tech, the whole town and their whole lives felt like a fast train towards conformity and monotony. Soon they find out that in a very rare and pivoting scene, that the sterilization of their hometown was not that very common feeling of returning home after years away, but the feeling of actual robots actually taking over with the goal of homogenizing everything, which I feel is a little less common of a feeling. From this point, the movie takes a sharp left turn from a coming-of-age dramedy to a sci-fi action thriller. And if anyone didn't see the trailers, this would certainly come as a shock to the viewer. I remember even watching this movie with my mom, who was enjoying it up until the scene in the bathroom, at which point the film becomes a global takeover action movie about fighting off robot oppressors. Not exactly a film that may appeal to a 60-year-old woman who spends most of her time watching Masterpiece Theater. Anyways, the film goes on, some further revelations are made, some hijinks ensue, some great action sequences occur, and the movie concludes on something of a bittersweet moment. But more on that later in the spoiler section of the video. So why this film? Why do I choose to review this film in the Cornetto trilogy with the other 2 movies are widely regarded as superior? Well, simply put, I don't think the other 2 films are superior. At least shouldn't be widely regarded as such. But just to be fair, I strongly enjoy both Sean and Fuzz. In fact, I almost hold up Hot Fuzz as the golden standard of comedic writing. Every punchline had a perfect setup. Every moment that occurs late in the film had the perfect setup early on in the film. And as for the great twist in Hot Fuzz, there is not a better structured twist for comedic purposes in all of cinema. In brief, the idea that the film spends the entire first 2 acts setting up a very plausible, very real, very complex crime scandal involving a real estate takeover only to throw it away for a very odd and peculiar twist that is just a town that cares an awful lot about being the quote-unquote best village. That's beyond funny. It's actually genius. And as for Shaun of the Dead, something can be said for being the first film in the trilogy, especially a film that introduces us to the talents of Pegg, Wright, and Frost, the combo of which have a perfect chemistry together. And the friendship between Sean and Ed in the film is among cinema's best on-screen chemistries, romantic or not. Bordering on romantic, actually. However, to dismiss The World's End as the lesser of the 3 films, I think is a rather hasty judgment, and should take further examination. I'll agree that Hot Fuzz is perhaps the best of the 3, purely for its comedic writing, but I oftentimes think that Shaun of the Dead is unfairly given cult-like status because it was a horror comedy about zombies, and horror comedies and zombies were, and still are, incredibly niche for college students and film buffs, which that film capitalized on tremendously. Good for it, but I think for those factors, it is unfairly placed above The World's End. But I would like to mount a defense for The World's End on the following 3 grounds. Number 1, the arc of the character. Easily one of the most important factors whenever engaging in storytelling is the arc of the main character. What sort of journey does your hero go on, and what must he or she accomplish? How do they change, or do they simply not change? Perhaps the point of the narrative is more self-acceptance and self-realization. Take The Nightmare Before Christmas as an example. The moral of the story was not about some illustrious change to the character, but more that of better understanding who he was and through his conflict, which in itself was an arc. Hegel's dialectic tells us that there are three progressions of an idea: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis is the initial idea that is thereby negated by the second idea, the antithesis. This conflict, therefore, must be resolved by a new third idea that combines these conflicting ideas into a functioning ideological framework. In other words, Jack Skellington was the Pumpkin King and thought Halloween was the sole meaning of his existence. Thesis. Then, by discovering Christmastown, Jack had a total polar opposite idea that he could be Santa Claus. Antithesis. Finally culminating in his realization that Halloween wasn't all there was in life, but that indeed he was best suited for Halloween, giving his failure as Santa Claus. Synthesis. While the characters of Shaun of the Dead and The World's End have very similar arcs, they are both in a state of arrested development, a perpetual state of adolescence. Whereas the goal of Shaun is to give up his childhood and become a man, Gary's goal is to recapture the glory of his youth. In essence, he doesn't ever want to grow up. So after the events of the story, where are each of the characters in terms of their arc? Well, interestingly enough, only one of the two has something of a positive arc. And spoiler, it's not Shaun. In Shaun of the Dead, Shaun has to prove to his girlfriend Liz that he is matured and wants to, in essence, become more of a man. And throughout the second and third acts of the film, it appears he's doing just that. He's taking on his role of a leader, protector for his group. He's imploring what he knows in order to keep everyone safe. He even shows his vulnerabilities in a very touching scene near the climax. So despite all of these progressions of character, where do you suppose Shaun ends up? Nowhere. Nothing. He accomplishes next to nothing in his life other than just to survive, which he is also unable to save all of his friends. But in Shaun's defense, I can't fault him on that one. It's a horror movie, and people tend to die in horror movies. The Shaun at the end of the movie has learned nothing and takes nothing he's learned to improve his life. He's mildly content with continuing to coast through life, accomplishing nothing and striving for nothing. Oh, except he has a zombie best friend, which is pretty cool. I suppose one should take away that the lesson from the movie was to enjoy the simple things in life. Except the whole movie sets up that that isn't the point. So to conclude, Shaun has a mild amount of development throughout the film, only to squander it for a throwaway lesson that wasn't even relevant to the movie. If this was the moral of the story, then it's better to argue Liz was the true hero of the story, as she actually goes on more of an arc by the end, since she's set up the whole story as thinking life is about striving for more, only to accept a quiet, simple life in an English town. So what of Gary? What does his arc tell us about him as our protagonist? Well, we see that his whole goal throughout the film was to recapture his youth, while his moral that he was supposed to take away was that it's unhealthy to constantly live in the past. And I'll say this, despite these seemingly contradicting messages and morals, this film actually allows Gary to achieve both. He recaptures his youth, but doesn't live in the past. And it's all based on one line at the ending. Where do we find Gary at the beginning of the film? In rehab, due to what appears to be alcoholism. Alcoholism brought on by severe depression. Depression brought on by feeling that his life never amounted to what he thought it was meant to. So the significance of that line is paramount to everything. It signals to the audience that Gary has indeed gotten better, that he was able to find happiness in somewhere other than the bottom of a glass. And yet still, he ended up getting exactly what he wanted, to be young again, to be free, to have a good time. So it might be insignificant. Perhaps it was thrown in just to show the audience that Gary had indeed grown as a character. Even then, even if it wasn't what it could have been, it was still more than Shaun of the Dead, which wastes an entire character arc for, honestly, I don't even know what. 2. Social commentary. The great thing about Cornetto Trilogy is that these 3 films are comedies, but they aren't spoofs or parodies. They truly respect the genre by which they are satirizing. Shaun of the Dead doesn't simply function as a comedy, but can make a decent horror film in and of itself. Hot Fuzz doesn't just make you laugh, but it sets up a great action thriller and with a good crime mystery. And the same is true for The World's End. It doesn't just go for cheap laughs, but it respects science fiction as a genre. And as science fiction happens to be my favorite genre of film or literature, naturally this kind of made The World's End a secret favorite of mine in the trilogy. So what is a science fiction? I know there is perhaps a good portion of the viewers who might be thinking, duh, it's a story about science, space and robots and shit. Okay, while those are often part of a science fiction story, they aren't the qualifiers. Think of Star Wars as an example. Now, I love Star Wars. I have since I was a little kid. But think to yourself, is Star Wars a science fiction film? If you think it is, let me ask you something. Do you think Star Wars has more in common with Harry Potter or iRobot? Really think about that. It's too simple to say iRobot since they both have robots. Both Harry Potter and Star Wars focus heavily on the hero's journey, about an adolescent who discovers their greater role in a larger world filled with magic and mysticism. I love Star Wars, but Star Wars has always been a space fantasy, or a space opera if you prefer, not a science fiction film comparable to Blade Runner, Matrix, or 1984. Science fiction often tells a story about society, where we've been, and more importantly, where are we going? They usually ask some fundamental questions and make predictions about our own future. George Orwell forecasted what a future with an ever-growing government might look like. Blade Runner asked a very fundamental question about what does it really mean to be human. The Matrix had us questioning reality itself. These were big questions that it took a keen sight into the future, or even into the present, in order to tell. And for a story like that, you need some elements of actual science to write a predictive story. I'm not comparing The World's End to some of the other great science fiction classics, but I feel it's wrong to dismiss it also. The World's End does indeed accurately tell us a problem with the world as it is, and where it could be heading. So what is The World's End telling us about society or our future? One word: Starbucks. I don't pretend to know or even guess what Edgar Wright's political beliefs are. I'm sure I'm wrong on a number of accounts. But if this film accurately reflects some of Wright's more deep-seated principles, my guess is he's not a fan of globalization. Now, everyone can read into a story their own notions, or what the author was trying to tell us. But what I feel Wright was trying to tell us is that the globalists are trying to take away our freedom. Okay, time to put on our tinfoil hats and tune into the Alex Jones channel. All jokes aside, perhaps my own paranoia, but I feel this film says perfectly what I feel a lot of people are feeling is happening in our world. Replace alien robots in this story for the globalist elite in reality, and you have essentially the same tale. The systematic stripping away of the individual right and the cultural fortitude of smaller communities like nation-states or townships in order to gentrify, homogenize, and broaden their global community. Disagree with me? Think of it. The whole goal presented by the robot invaders is to bring Earth into a state of passive conformity in order to assimilate them into the larger galactic community. And in order to bring about that assimilation, the robots don't really have a need for so many humans, as humans being are prone to rebellion and individualism by their nature. So what do the robots do with those humans who choose not to conform? Well, watch the movie. The robots systematically replace the humans with their robot clones, which by design be much better at assimilation. There is no pesky innate need for the robots to be free like humans. They are designed to perfectly align with the system. That's where the globalists introduce the contributors such as Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and other tech giants into the fold. By using their knowledge and expertise in the fields of artificial intelligence and robotics, the globalist elite can facilitate that transition towards a new world order by transitioning the human brain over to something more akin to a computer. Programmable. Easily controlled. In essence, a mind devoid of freedom, which fundamentally Gary is concerned with. And simply for the record, I do believe that Elon Musk has a soul. Sorry. In the face of this metaphorical threat, Gary is immune to logic or reason, which in some ways seems to be the best defense against those that are pushing back against this wave of globalization. On paper, it seems good. It seems to be that there is no social scientist or economist in the world that would diminish the gains globalization can do for the world. And yet here we are, facing a political wave characterized by the populace yearning to remain sovereign. A wave of nationalism has sprung up as a counterforce to the wave of globalization over the past 30 years or so. And why? Simply put, There is something that those technocratic elite don't account for when designing their perfect world. Freedom. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. There exists inside the spirit of all humans that yearns for more freedom. Those that don't want to be told what to do. Those that want to hold their elected officials accountable. Those that want to live by their own choices and accept the consequences of those choices. As Gary so puts it, to err is human. This is why some might view the ending of The World's End as a comical tragedy. The idea that a drunk idiot doomed humanity to a new dark age. Funny enough, I don't see the ending that way. I see it as a call to adventure and hope for a better tomorrow. The post-apocalyptic world that the film sets up at the end is filled with humans rebuilding, not giving up. They were rebuilding a world that they have chosen to create. They were not cogs in someone else's grand design, stripped away of their agency like children, which is how the robots view humans in The World's End, and how the global elites view the masses. Children that need to be guided and steered away from the sharp corner edges. I say, ram that head into that coffee table. The blood reminds us that we are human and we are still free. Number 3, personal relevance. Now, I suppose this next point I'm going to make is a tad personal and doesn't actually reflect the quality of the film, but instead reflects my state of mind when I first viewed it. I had first saw this film back in 2013 when it first premiered. I had perhaps anticipated this film more than practically any other film with the exception of Force Awakens, but I'll save that commentary for another video. Fucking shite, laddie. I saw the film during a very important transitional phase in my life. It was my last semester of my college career, and as many could and would attest, that this is a very perplexing time for most youth. For the first 18 to 24 years of our lives are so structured in such a way that it is perhaps a bit daunting for when it comes next. I had been studying finance and accounting while in college, but by the point I saw this film, I had already made the conscious decision that I was never going to work in that field. My reasoning for this is quite personal and deeply philosophical, perhaps best explained in a later video. But in short, I didn't want to become what I feared I could potentially become if I had stayed the course. So when I saw this film, I saw the story of a man who never became anything. He saw his friends pass him in all manners of ways until he reached the point where he was nothing but a distant stranger to them. Like Gary King, I too chose an alternative path that would not bring me much financial success or social status, all while I saw my friends surpass me in these regards as the time went on. I have friends who are on the fast track towards executive level status. I have friends that have traveled the world extensively on different job opportunities. I have friends that have started and sold their businesses for seemingly tremendous gains. And where was I? I was 22, and I pissed away my one chance at a higher education to get a good job on something that I was determined never to do in the real world. Now, before you begin feeling that this is a woe is me story, I can assure you that as the years went on, I don't regret any of my decisions that stemmed from this time in my life. I feel very accomplished in what I set forth to accomplish, and I am unreasonably happy based on my unreasonable goals. However, can I say without a shadow of a doubt that this wasn't a daunting point in my life, filled with an uneasy dread? Yes. As a matter of fact, I can. Yet still, here I was watching a film about a has-been who never amounted to anything worthwhile because he was completely lacking any sort of direction or ambition. A very relatable character for me at the time. And even though the film portrayed Gary as a joke and a cautionary tale, I still couldn't help but idolize the man for some reason. Gary was free, in all the ways his friends were not. And by the end of the story, does he straighten up, fly right, and take stock in his life? Not particularly. Gary doesn't change his goals even by the end of the film. He just has a better understanding as to what these goals truly mean. And for that reason, when I saw this movie in the theater, I left it more confident than ever to abandon this so-called corporate dream and refocus my life on the pursuit of freedom and happiness. So there you have it, The World's End. Is it a perfect movie? No. Is it the best in its own series? I'd also say no. But does it deserve more acknowledgement and praise than it has gotten since its release? Well, I'll leave that one up to you. All I ask is that we don't compare this film to Paul anymore. I mean, honestly, look ridiculous right now. Shame on you, fucking hell. Paul? God damn. I'm gonna go watch Paul. Maybe it's not as bad as I remember.
Just what is it that you want to do?
We want to get loaded, and we want to have a good time.
That's it for me today, my faithful few. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe. We post video essays like this on the channel all the time. And by all the time, I mean once every 6 months when I can find the time. Life is hard, folks. And maybe that's the topic of my next video. Till then, adios.